everyone, and welcome back to Polina's Pages. Today is finally part 5 of my new Dracula series. I can't believe how quickly time has flown by. Last time we left off with Renfield being found in a pool of blood, so now we start off with chapter 21 and Seward investigating. So Seward finds Renfield lying on the floor in a pool of blood on his left side. His face is horribly bruised. He was beaten with his head against the floor, so that's where the blood is coming from, and his back is broken, paralyzing his arm and the side of his face. So it's clear Renfield didn't do this to himself, which leaves the question, who? The obvious answer being Dracula. So Dr. Seward sends for Van Helsing, and also Van Helsing sends for Quincy and Arthur. So the two burst in, and right away Quincy says, "My God, what has happened to him? Poor, poor devil." So it's implied that this is a fate that you would not wish even upon your worst enemy, because frankly Renfield looks, well, half dead, and it's shown that Dracula doesn't really care for his allies. He doesn't have this moral conduct of like no friendly fire. He doesn't have any form of loyalty. He doesn't have any form of obligation or what he views as his moral duty, because he's not good enough for that. And so Renfield, of course, has been betrayed by his ally because he has thought that they were partners. And of course the sad irony is that he says poor devil when the devil himself, Dracula, is of course well and truly thriving. They seem to be losing the patient by proceeding too slowly though, and being concerned with like, oh, what can we do? What can we operate? Can we not operate? And so when Helsing speaks, there is no time to lose. His words may be worth many lives. I have been thinking so as I stood here. It may be there is a soul at stake. He silently begins to operate as we hold out hope that everything will be okay for Renfield, because of course Mina's life also depends on him. And when Renfield comes to consciousness, he tells him to remove the straight jacket and that he's okay, but he just had a really bad dream and he doesn't understand why his body hurting, and then he begins to drift out of consciousness again, just for Quincy to bring him some brandy and for him to realize, I must not deceive myself, it was no dream but all a grim reality. So with urgency he begins to tell Van Helsing what happens. He remarks on that urgency saying, I don't have much time left. So in the night he suddenly felt that there was a sudden peace, and then the dogs barked, and he knew not where he was, but he didn't know where Dracula was either. So it's implied that before there was an element of hypnosis to the situation and he wasn't aware of his surroundings, but suddenly he became aware, and that's when he acquired strange peace. He came up to the window in the mist as I had seen him often before. Oh, by the way, him is capitalized. He was solid then, not a ghost, and his eyes were fierce like a man's when angry. He was laughing with his red mouth. The sharp white teeth glinted in the moonlight when he turned to look back over the belt of trees to where the dogs were barking. Then he began promising me things, not in words but by doing them. So his eyes were fierce like a man, highlights that even Renfield does not see his master as human, and the dogs once again alert us to the presence of supernatural, implying that animals can sense more than we can. Dracula begins to call on all the rats and all the flies and promises their lives to Renfield. He says he will give them to Renfield if he will fall and worship him. And then a red cloud, like the color of blood, seemed to close over my eyes, and before I knew what I was doing, I found myself opening the sash and saying to him, "Come in, Lord and Master." Then Dracula disappears, and the next day when he appears again, Renfield gets really angry because he hasn't held his promise, but Dracula merely sneers at him and leaves, knowing that Renfield is powerless to stop him. Then Mina shows up to visit Renfield, and she wasn't the same. It was like tea after the teapot had been watered. What an effective simile to compare her to the diluted version of her, because of course Dracula is drinking her very purity, her very essence, as we have talked about in the previous parts. It made me mad to know that he had been taking the life out of her. Renfield bursts to defend Mina, and he pounces on the mist because he doesn't want her to bleed out anymore, again showing what an influence Mina has by being such a good Christian woman. Dracula uses his eyes to hypnotize him. They burned into me, and my strength became like water. He slipped through it, and when I tried to cling to him, he raised me up and flung me down. The men quickly rush to Harker's room, and they find poor Mina with blood on the nightgown, and Dracula is forcing her face onto his bosom, and she's trying to resist, but he has to hold her arms away, and the two remark that it is like a kitten being forced to feed. Where Lucy was more passive, Mina is actively trying not to become the fallen woman, desperately trying to resist him drinking from her. It's also a far more disturbing image than Lucy's more romantic one. It's much more like an an assault and a violation, Mina is the stereotypical virgin, as the virgin had traditionally played an important role for Christianity with the Virgin Mary and also for Victorian society. Those roles were still very important because it was the value of tradition. Actually, going back to history with the example of Henry VIII's grounds for divorce, he claimed he did not consummate the marriage with Catherine so he could marry Anne Boleyn. So traditionally, you would only not be a virgin if you were married. You would be expected to make the marriage official. I expect Jonathan and Mina had consummated their marriage, so she's not quite the virgin, but she's still portrayed like a virgin in a way. It's just that she's this virtuous young woman now, and it's her purity Dracula stealing while her husband lays to the side. His eyes flamed red with devilish passion. The great nostrils of the white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edges, and the white sharp teeth behind the full lips of the blood-dripping mouth champed together like those of a wild beast. Dracula is about to pounce on the man, but Van Helsing holds up the sacred wafer and he cowers back, eventually fleeing. Poor Mina gives out a scream so wild, so ear-piercing, so despairing, that Seward writes it will live with him to his dying day. Her face was ghastly with a pallor, which was accentuated by the blood which smeared her lips and cheeks and chin. From her throat trickled a thin stream of blood. Her eyes were mad with terror. Van Helsing covers her with a sheet, and he lets her recover, giving her his privacy while they try to bring Jonathan out of his stupor and hypnosis. Jonathan, when he realizes where he is, his first thought is of Mina, and because he sees all the blood, it's a terrifying reality to wake up to. He desperately hopes Mina is okay, and Van Helsing comforts him, saying that with a crucifix she is safe, and she rests for a moment on Jonathan's breast. But then she notices that she's actually staining his clothes with her blood, and she sobs, "Unclean, unclean, I must touch him or kiss him no more. Oh, that it should be that it is I who am now his worst enemy." This was Mina's biggest fear, to become the fallen woman, and she's fearful that she lost her purity and virginity. She does not see herself as being a worthy woman of her husband anymore. The phrase unclean is also a reference to the Bible, Leviticus, I believe, about the lepers, and lepers at the time was like this derogatory term used for people with the skin disease, and so with the skin falling off of their faces, it was sort of like they were the undead as well. So she sees herself as a leper and as unclean because their skin is not pure. And actually, I think it's another allusion to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner with the lepers that they encountered in that tale too. So she views herself as having fallen, and Jonathan for his part tells her it is nonsense. It is a shame to me to hear such a word. Like a truly loving husband, he does not care whether she's pure or not, and I think this is a very poignant point that Stoker is making. Yes, in the eyes of society, your wife may not be pure anymore, but you know perfectly well it's not her fault that she was assaulted. So why would you actively choose to cut her off just because of your reputation? Stoker's making a point that if you truly love her as you claim that you do, this all wouldn't matter. Mina then recaps what happened and talks about how disgusting and powerless she felt, and yet how she was thinking of Jonathan and the poor men who have suffered, and she did not want to bother them with her condition of feeling lethargic or feeling tired. And I just want to ask here, how many women have not told other people about their condition because they didn't want to be dismissed, especially during Victorian times, especially with those ideas of hysteria that were propagated. For example, in the yellow wallpaper, we see the woman who has those mental issues, but her husband simply dismisses it as hysteria. Or in Kim Jo-young, born 1982, those problems still prevail today because women have a need to socially please since they were socialized to do it, and that is why Mina has not told them, and that is why they have also failed to take into account and consider the problems back at home, because they were rushing head on into battle without considering what are they fighting for. Dracula had told Mina, "And so you, like the others, would play your brains against mine. You would help these men to hunt me and frustrate me in my designs. You know now, and they know in part already, and will know in full before long what it is to cross my path. They should have kept their energies for use closer to home, whilst they played wits against me who commanded nations and intrigued for them and fought for them. Hundreds of years before they were born, I was countermining them. And you, their best beloved one, are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my bountiful winepress for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper." Basically, Dracula was really petty about the fact that someone had decided to challenge him after all these years, because of course Dracula still views himself as being this pure noble being and you're all peasants in my vicinity. So that's why he's taking pleasure in corrupting the purity of Mina's blood, and he's taking pleasure in the fact that she will now do his bidding. As she was telling her terrible story, the eastern sky began to quicken and everything became more and more clear. Again, the reference to the xenophobic prejudiced views against the East and how the Easterners apparently have no moral conduct if they're chasing after our women. That stereotypical British belief of the prejudiced Victorian society. And this unfortunate chapter ends with the quote, "The sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course." Because Harker becomes even more sad, his grey look deepens, and with his grey look, so too does the misery of the rest of the men come to cloud around them as they realize that their poor Mina is now gone. This chapter starts with Jonathan, who's waiting with Mina and waiting for Van Helsing and Dr. Seward come back from their visit to Renfield. Mina says that it is in trouble and trial that our faith is tested, that we must keep on trusting and that God will aid us up to the end. It's solely Mina's belief that's keeping her as a being right now. It's solely her Christian faith, the fact that she doesn't shy away from these difficulties. Jonathan recaps what happened to Renfield in this chapter here, but I won't go over it since we already talked about it before, and also that Renfield had called out God, God, God in his final moments, showing that he did indeed turn to God, and they decide to put as the cause of his death that he fell off his bed, unfortunately, because they don't want to alert the public to what's happening. They finally decide to let Mina in on what's happening. Nothing of any sort, no matter how painful, should be kept from her, and Mina declares that she's ready to kill herself if need be because she doesn't want the men to suffer, and she doesn't want to have them hurt her because she knows it will be very difficult. But Van Helsing tells her to not do it. You must struggle and strive to live. Though death would seem a boon unspeakable, you must fight death himself, though he come to you in pain or in joy, by the day or the night, in safety or in peril. Van Helsing urges the men with an inspirational speech to track down the rest of the boxes and to kill Dracula before he can gain any more power. They say that they will get someone to pick the lock for the house in Piccadilly and no one will suspect them because they are respectable and wealthy men. All that is in doubt is the conscience of the employer and the belief of your power as to whether or not that employer has a good conscience or a bad one. By doing this in broad daylight, they are technically doing this by the law because they're pretending that this house belongs to them and they're willing to take a chance that the constables are not going to look their way. Arthur will provide them with horse carriages and Van Helsing will be there as a respectable figure. So technically they're using their wealth and they're using their status to leverage it and to have an advantage over this situation. It's only by coming together with their efforts, Van Helsing will do this, Arthur will do this, that they can actually come together and defeat Dracula. Because where Dracula, sure, he can be stronger than 20 men, but he's alone, and there's power in numbers, and there's power in humanity, and socializing together, and working together. But obviously before they go, something must be done to protect Mina, and Van Helsing assures her she is quite safe here until the sunset, and he places the sacred wafer in the name of the Father, the Son, and places it on her forehead. And at that point she screams because the metal has seared into her flesh. She wails, "Unclean, unclean, even the Almighty shuns my polluted flesh." Again, we see the difference in Lucy and Mina's treatment in the book and in their description, because Lucy's condition is almost romanticized. I mean, her femininity is very much highlighted, that classic idea of fragile femininity, how she's on her bed, she's swooning, she's so weak, and Arthur's this manly guy who's there to resurrect her. Mina is actively trying to pursue her own fate. She's actively making decisions, and more than that, she's fighting, and she's not this innocent young woman who's ready to just give up and lie on her bed and die. And Mina's struggles are far more emphasized, described in brutal honesty. Her pain is clear, she's less feminine in the dainty sense, and when Helsing attempts to comfort her that it may be that you may have to bear that mark till God sees himself fit, as he most surely shall on the judgment day, to redress all wrongs of the earth and of his children that he has placed thereon. That scar will pass once her inside is as clean as her outside. That cross to bear is much like Jesus bore the sins of humanity. So in a way, Mina's taking the sins of humanity onto her. She's representing that ideal woman. She's the pure woman who can handle the suffering. That was Lucy too. If Lucy actually got the treatment she deserved, but they all saw her as a weak woman and they didn't think that she should bear it. And that's why she was unable to bear that burden and to embody the human condition, more specifically the female condition. Jonathan decides that if we find out that Mina must be a vampire in the end, then she shall not go into that unknown and terrible land alone. It's implied that either he will kill Dracula or he will kill himself to join her, and they enter Carfax without trouble, and they sterilize the earth, and they sterilize the boxes, and Dracula has chosen it because it was holy. Likewise, they get into Piccadilly and they're nervous that Dracula will be there, but of course he isn't, so it's a very anticlimactic ending. Once again, the main action of the novel doesn't take place into these parts, and honestly, I think this book could have used a little bit of editing because these last few chapters, they're there to keep the suspense, but at this point we're getting a little frustrated. They sent out Quincy and Arthur to check out the other potential addresses, and the rest await their return and go back to their house, and also await the coming of the Count. Seward, the professor, and Harker wait for Quincy and Arthur to come back, and the professor does his best attempt to distract Harker. The poor fellow is overwhelmed in a misery that is appalling to see. Last night he was a frank, happy-looking man with strong, youthful face, full of energy and with dark brown hair. Today he's a drawn, haggard old man whose white hair matches well with the hollow, burning eyes and grief-written lines of his face. The worry has aged poor Harker, and again it's highlighted that he's human, whereas Dracula doesn't age and doesn't worry and doesn't have any of these godly concerns because he's a monster with a child's brain. Harker has those very real qualities. And we also find out more about Dracula's backstory. He was a wonderful soldier, statesman, and alchemist, and he had a heart that knew no fear and no remorse. He's also experimenting with what he knows even now. He attended the scholomance, and there was no branch of knowledge of this time that he did not essay. So it's implied that he pursued everything. At the very risk of everything, at the very risk of his religion, he pursued all the branches of science, and that's where he was led astray. Again, this conflict between science and religion. The professor also points out that Festina Lente must be his motto, because very surely he's exploring his power and he's developing. He's no longer just this brainless victim and this brainless bat that leeches off of other people. He has his tactics. He got to Renfield so that he can get into John's home. He got to Lucy so that he could get to Arthur, and now he got to Mina. This guy is progressing and he's learning bad tactics. Arthur and Quincy come back, and both Carfax and Piccadilly had 6 boxes each. They destroyed them all, so now Dracula has no resting place. The 5 men get ready for Dracula's return. They arm themselves, they prepare the holy water, and then when Dracula appears, Jonathan swipes at Dracula with a knife, showing Jonathan's change. He's no longer just this timid creature who can barely climb out of the window and he thinks, oh, it's so unpleasant, oh dear, what can I do? No, he's the one who's attacking. He's right up there with the other men, showing his bravery, showing his chivalry, because now he has this damsel in distress that he wants to protect. It would be impossible to describe the expression of hate and baffled malignity, of anger and hellish rage which came over the Count's face. His waxen hue became greenish yellow by the contrast of his burning eyes, and the red scar on the forehead showed on the pallid skin like a palpitating wound. Throughout the novel, Stoker never ceases to impress me with his detailed characterization and with his description of appearance and emotion. Dracula's physiognomy says everything. Just like the sky shows the mood, so too can Dracula's face and the color of his face show the expressions. My revenge has just begun. I spread it over centuries and time is on my side. Your girls that you all love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine, my creatures, to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed. Then he leaves in rage, but nevertheless he flees. He flees. For the first time, he escapes. He's not just running away. He's not just waltzing away. He's running away. And he wants to get to the men through their counterparts because your women are my women. And he knows that it will be hard for them to resist the charms of their wife, which is why he seduces them. So he's thinking that once the wives fall, so too will the men. And actually, I think it's interesting to link this back to the homosexuality that we talked about in the first part, about how he really doesn't want female vampires. I mean, those 3 women, those are his sisters. Dracula doesn't want women as his counterparts. He also thinks that they're weak. Yes, they have their advantages with their female charms, but he wants male counterparts. He wants male allies. He even says about Dracula, this man is mine. He wants to seduce specifically men. Women are just a tool. They tell Mina of what she has transpired, and poor Mina, she turns pale, but she silently listens. Unlike the men, she listens without interruption, which I think is a really good quality for her to have. have, because she actually takes in the information and she processes it, whereas when Mina is telling it, they can't help but add in their little comments, and I think it really distracts, because if they actually gave her a chance to just say everything that she wanted to say, because she's the one who's actually behind all the planning and all the scheduling, I think they would have defeated Dracula a lot quicker, to be honest. And she says that once again they must kill her. She impresses all of them with her bravery and purity, that sweet, sweet, good woman in all the radiant beauty of her youth and animation, with a red scar on her forehead of which she was conscious and which we saw with grinding of her teeth, remembering whence or how it came, her loving kindness against our grim hate. She with all her goodness and purity and faith was outcast from God. So the sad thing is that although Mina is the perfect woman, she's rejected. And I think Stoker makes this rather pointed, this moment, because it goes back to the idea that in Christianity, a lot of the times the church was very judgmental. Perhaps even more accurate to say in the present tense, is sometimes very judgmental, and it judges you for sins that you have not committed. Mina's words leave all the men in tears, and I think it goes back to that idea of like, yeah, sure, throw the stone, but let that first stone be thrown by the man who has not sinned. So you can't be judging Mina for her actions when there have been other things that were committed worse. And Mina's words leave all the men in tears, and for the souls of the poor couple who are forced to deal with this situation, and they arrange to stay up during the night to watch over Mina and hope for the best. Then we go to Jonathan's journal, because poor Jonathan can barely sleep. He's so concerned about Mina, and also he hears a strange sound in the hallway and he creeps out, and just when we think it's going to be Dracula, it's actually Quincy. And one of them will always be there, and Mina is very relieved. Oh, thank God for good, brave men. So actually, we see that the suspense is really being stretched out right now, because it's not to Stoker's advantage to have the final scene now. It needs to be at the climax, at the culmination of the novel. And the next day, Mina comes up with a genius idea, which makes me wonder why Van Helsing didn't think of it. But she says, hypnotize me. I know you can do it, and it will help us know about Dracula's whereabouts. And so Van Helsing waves his hands around and her eyes close, and her voice changes, and she reaches the threshold. And it's that theme of liminality and sort of transgression and boundaries, because before we talked about how important it is to be on the edge of consciousness and like unconsciousness, sleep and waking, and now it's that being sort of aware and not being aware at the same time. So her consciousness merges with Dracula, because of course she drank his blood as well. She knows that he's on a ship somewhere right now. They have time to prepare for their arrival, and they have to, if they do not kill him soon, she will turn into a vampire. She also sees that the day when they ambushed him, they actually did take him by surprise. He didn't expect the attack, and Van Helsing explains that they must find him urgently because he can live for centuries, and you are but mortal woman. Time is now to be dreaded, since once he put that mark upon your throat again. Mina faints and the chapter ends. And I think it's interesting again that in some moments Mina is this very like masculine for Victorian times, masculine woman who makes her own decisions, who wants her own career, and at the same time she's that angel in the house. I mean, we talked about this before, but I think here in particular, highlighting her strength and then also juxtaposing it to her weakness, she faints when she's reminded that actually you're just a mortal woman. I think it really juxtaposes her two sides, and it shows the duality of woman and her complexity as a character. She's not this boring timid mouse that people make her out to be. And I have to say, these chapters do really stretch out, because it gets to be about the boxes and hunting Dracula down. So I'm sorry, but these next two chapters are going to whoosh past just a little bit. So chapter 24 starts with a message from Van Helsing to Jonathan. The professor tells him to stay by Mina's side. This is your best and most holiest office. Dracula is actually attempting to flee back to Transylvania with the final box, so that's why they try to intercept him at the docks, and he says that all is not lost for Jonathan and Mina. He's finite, though he's powerful to do much harm and suffers not as we do. But we are strong, each in our purpose, and we are all more strong together. This battle is what began, and in the end we shall win, so sure as that God sits on high to watch over his children. In other words, we have trust in Christian purpose, and we will defeat Dracula and restore Mina to her previous state. The novel has a slightly symmetric structure in that we circle back to what has happened at the beginning with Harker fleeing to England, but this time it is Dracula fleeing to his homeland, so we see just how much the roles have been reversed. Then we come back to Jonathan Harker's journal, who updates on Mina suddenly being very happy because everything seems lighter now that Van Helsing gave him hope. And I mean, that is the power of hope, to believe in the most trying of times, and what could be more trying than literally just the devil walking on earth, evil and sin being all around us. So then we cut to Mina's journal, who's keeping a record of the meeting that the men are having because she's finally being included. And Van Helsing reports that she dug through ship journals and newspapers and found that a ship called the Tsarina Catherine had headed for the Black Sea, and a tall man, thin and pale, with high nose and teeth so white and eyes that seem to be burning, that he be all in black except that he have a hat of straw which suit him, not him or the time, that he scatter his money in making quick inquiry as to what ship sails for the Black Sea and for where. So a man matching Dracula's description was seen, and the last wooden box is probably there. He has placed himself there, and Mina's hypnosis had also backed the theory that Dracula is on the ship, and on interviewing the crew, the professor found that the man who they saw brought up blood a lot of times. Notice how similar this is to when Dracula went on the ship Demeter and sailed for England, except this time it's an Eastern European ship and the crew is more distrustful because, unlike British people who are unaccustomed to having evil or the threat of evil on their footsteps, they actually have those superstitions because they interact and they talk to each other, and they see that actually, well, you can't know for sure what threats you're gonna face, so it's better to be prepared. Forewarned means forearmed. Also, the ship is called Catherine the Great ship, which who was a fierce Russian empress, and she basically got to her position by kicking her husband off the throne, let's say, by plotting and by intrigue. And so I think here it's a very pointed commentary that actually perhaps Mina and her planning will outdo Dracula once more. It's a bit of foreshadowing that there is actually a happy ending to this story. I feel a wonderful peace and rest tonight, writes Mina, because she feels easier knowing they're on Dracula's tail, but my surmise was not finished. Could not be, for I caught sight in the mirror of the red mark upon my forehead, and I knew that I was still unclean. Much like the victims of sexual assault, it's hard not to feel like the perpetrator is always with you when you have been violated. Seward's diary, entry on the 5th of October. Just as we feel like tensions are calming down, Van Helsing tells Seward, Madame Mina, our poor dear Madame Mina, is changing. They must be prepared to kill her, and they have to find Dracula so that they can kill him before they have to prepare to kill her. Later, the group meets without Mina, and also because Van Helsing suspects Mina of being very influenceable, easily influenced by Dracula now, so they want to conceal information, and they decide to prepare to travel to Varna, the Black Sea port in Romania, to track down the Tsarina Catherine. And Van Helsing tells them to arm themselves, but Quincy adds that I propose that we add Winchesters to our armament. I have a kind of belief in a Winchester when there's any trouble of that sort around. I mean, it's hard to not feel like this is another example of satire on Stoker's part, poking fun at the Americans and their renowned love for certain types of weaponry. Mina realizes that she may accidentally report to the Count, so she asks Harker not to share any plans with her, and Harker writes, I felt from that instant a door had been shut between us. He's very hesitant to allow secrets into their new marriage, which I think is a very admirable quality, considering the fact that many men at the time would not have viewed it as their duty to say anything to their wives. So I think it shows how much Jonathan actually cares for Mina and how progressive their relationship and marriage is. She decides to accompany the men to Romania, though, because of her hypnotic condition, and Van Helsing agrees. They will sail in the morning, and Quincy vows to kill Dracula, no matter if the other people see them, because it's a big concern that other people might not understand that Dracula is a vampire, so they're committing a crime by killing him. But Quincy says that he doesn't care and he might go to jail. It's fine. Van Helsing praises him for his bravery, and Harker writes a will passing the estate on to Mina if he does die, showing that even in a stressful moment he is concerned with property and estate, because of course wealth was a key concern during Victorian times. Mina seems to be less susceptible to Dracula around dawn and dusk. Again, the threshold, the sun, the day, the night. Dracula's pull is weakened, and during those times she asks every single man to promise to kill her. When you shall be convinced that I am so changed that it is better that I die that I may live. When I am thus dead in the flesh, then you will, without a moment's delay, drive a stake through me and cut off my head, or do whatever else may be wanting to give me rest. She's ready to give her life bravely. She also asks to read the burial service in front of her, causing everyone to cry. The next bits are actually made up from short bits of journaling from Jonathan. It's very repetitive, much like the travel on a ship would be during those times. So they just hypnotize Mina and they ask her like, oh, where's Dracula? Oh, I hear the lapping of waves over and over again. I mean, endlessly. Honestly, it was very hard to drag myself through this part of the book, if I'm being honest, because it's just the same thing over and over again for a week. And then on October the 24th, a telegram finally arrives from the London ship company saying that the ship has arrived, although Mina continues to deny it. And the men do not tell her that they are preparing, and Van Helsing begins to suspect that actually it's just that Mina is being deceived by Dracula, and Seward is ready to kill Mina if need arises. Euthanasia is an excellent and a comforting word. I am grateful to whoever invented it. Mina falls even more lethargic and tired, and they continue to wait, but on October 26th, fog falls. So things are literally getting more mysterious and gloomy as a precursor to the climax of the novel. On the 28th, another telegram informs them that the ship has gone to the Galatz port, which is far away, so the group takes a train and realizes Dracula has been misdirecting them. Now, certainly, and so Dracula's skills have indeed been improved. Mina only feels that the wolves are near Dracula in chapter 26, but that's it. Wolves, of course, being a symbol of danger and his evil allies, and the next day she says that she can hear cattle and they figure out that he must be traveling back to his estate. Mina determines that it would be easiest for Dracula to move over water and uses the map to figure out that the Ceres and the Pruth rivers are nearby. They also interviewed the terrified sailors. Actually, her journal entries a full-on detective-like plan investigating all of Dracula's potential roads, and again, this shows her incredible mind and how well she can plan. Better than the men in her group who seem more concerned about the fight at this point, which is a bit strange because they have advocated previously for stopping and thinking, so I think it's just to highlight how well Mina's brain works. Van Helsing will stay with Mina while the rest of the group will go to find Dracula. Mina and Jonathan share an emotional goodbye, and we see that their trials have brought them closer together, and it's hard not to feel sympathy for Arthur at this moment because, of course, I don't know, it just feels like deja vu because we've already seen this with Lucy and Arthur, except that they were brought further apart because of Lucy's illness and Arthur's absences to do with his father's death. Mina writes, "Oh, it did me good to see the way that these brave men worked. How can women help loving men when they are so earnest and so true and so brave? And too, it made me think of the wonderful power of money. What can it not do when it is properly applied? And what might it do when basely used?" Mina acknowledges that if it weren't for Quincy and Arthur's riches, they would not have been so well equipped. Harker is forced to return to fight his demons quite literally as they begin to travel to the castle and the group splits apart, and their journey has some delays and some language issues. Mina and Van Helsing set out a few days later. She's worried for Jonathan, he's worried for her, and the professor notices that the hypnosis is no longer working. We are truly in the hands of God. He alone knows what may be, and I pray him with all the strength of my sad and humble soul that he will watch over my beloved husband. Again, she thinks only of her husband. In chapter 27, Van Helsing writes a memorandum to Seward explaining that Mina seems to be turning, she's weak, she doesn't want to eat, and as they travel over the Borgo Pass, he grows really concerned, so he builds this holy circle, and that holy circle, I have to say, saves their lives, because the three women appear in that intolerably sweet tone. They say, "Come sister, come to us, come, come," and Van Helsing drives them off and Mina falls asleep, but the bad weather continues to delay the rest of the men, and he leaves Mina in the holy circle, and he goes out in search of their graves because Van Helsing and Mina have already gotten to the castle, although the rest of the group hasn't. I doubt not that in old time, when such things were, many a man who set forth to do such a task as mine found at the last his heart fail him, and then his nerve. So he delay and delay and delay, till the mere beauty and the fascination of the wanton undead have hypnotized him, and he remained on and till sunset come and the vampire's sleep be over. Then the beautiful eyes of the fair woman open and look love, and the voluptuous mouth present to a kiss, and man is weak, and there remain one more victim in the vampire fold. Van Helsing in this anticlimactic moment calmly kills all of them, and though his soul weeps because he feels like a butcher, he rubs garlic over the castle entry, he calmly kills them, and they wait. Mina's transformation is almost complete, and they meet up with the rest of the group and they wait for Dracula's carriage to appear. They see him traveling with their troop and they leap out and they surround the gypsies. They quickly overpower them and they are, well, because they're armed, it's pretty easy, so they back off. There is a brief fight, but it's fairly easy. They pry open Dracula's coffin, they plunge the... Jonathan cuts off his head, Quincy plunges the knife into his heart. It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. But just as we rejoice, Quincy sinks to his knees with a with a knife wound. He's not saddened. God be thanked that all has not been in vain. See, the snow is not more stainless than her forehead. The curse has passed away. And to her bitter grief, with a smile and silence, he died a gallant gentleman. Dracula himself appears to die happily, knowing that his soul is freed. Quincy, however, has a tragic end. Although his soul is in heaven, he died without having the chance to live and see the happiness. But to be fair, I think he was pretty happy because he got to be the knight that he always wanted to be. The closing note states that 7 years later, this book is being published. Mina and Harker had a child together and they called him Quincy, so in that way Quincy is reborn. Actually, Seward and Arthur married a different woman. We don't know who they married. I think it's a shame, but they live happily ever after. And they come back to Transylvania, and it's looking back at this map and this castle, it's hard to believe that all these things happened, but they say, reader, it is actually true. So they portray this fictional story to actually be non-fiction, which actually at the time of publication led a lot of people to consider it as the truth, which I think is very interesting because of course with the lack of exposure to the internet and its publication, oh, it must be an honorable and truthworthy book. But yeah, with that we conclude the series. Thank you so much for making it this far. I cannot stress how much it means to me that you were here all this time, that you watched until the end. It honestly really means a lot. So thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and I hope you will stay for the other journeys that we take on this channel. I'll see you next time.